The hangar door rolled open, and Lucas Grant, the new chief executive of Carter Meridian Aviation, saw a man in a faded maintenance jumpsuit standing beside the company's most valuable jet. He did not ask who the man was. He did not wait for an explanation. "Get out of my hangar," Lucas roared, his voice bouncing off the steel rafters while a dozen engineers froze mid-task. The single father across from him peeled off his gloves without a word, set his access badge on the tool bench, and asked who had authorized an uncertified part to be installed on that engine. Lucas laughed and ordered security to drag him out. Seconds later, the chairman of the board walked in, lowered his head, and said the company had been waiting all morning for Mr. Carter's instructions. Stay until the end to find out why the arrogant executive ended up begging the very man he had just humiliated. Carter Meridian Aviation operated out of a private terminal outside Dallas, Texas, and had spent more than a decade building a reputation among executives, government contractors, and public officials who needed to fly without compromise. The company's unwritten law was simple. Safety was never for sale, no matter how much money sat on the other side of the ledger. But in the 2 years since its founder had quietly stepped back from public life, that principle had begun to erode from the inside, one shortcut at a time. Lucas Grant had been brought in from a rival airline group with a single mandate from the board: grow the fleet, grow the margins, and prepare the company for a major investment deal that could double its valuation within 18 months. On his first morning in the corner office, he gathered the department heads and announced that he intended to strip out what he called slow, outdated, and fear-driven procedures that were holding the company back. He ordered every maintenance division to cut turnaround time by 20% within the quarter, insisting that competitors were already flying circles around them. Amelia Hayes, the director of flight safety, warned him plainly that aviation did not forgive the kind of thinking that worked in other industries, and that shaving a few hours off an inspection could someday cost something that could never be shaved back. Lucas dismissed her concerns as resistance to change, the predictable grumbling of someone who preferred the comfort of old rules to the discomfort of progress. Connor Blake, the operations director, saw an opening in that friction and moved quickly to fill it, presenting spreadsheets that promised the company millions in savings if it switched to a new parts supplier with faster lead times and lower costs. What Connor never mentioned was that the supplier traced back, through 2 shell layers, to a company quietly controlled by his own younger brother. Lucas, eager to show results inside his first 30 days, barely glanced past the summary page before signing off on a provisional order for a batch of engine pressure valves that had not completed independent certification. He wanted numbers on a board before the next investor call, and Connor had handed him exactly the kind of number that photographed well in a slide deck. At the same time, an anonymous report reached a private inbox that few people inside the company even knew existed, describing irregular changes to maintenance sign-off procedures over the previous 6 weeks. Instead of arriving with lawyers or department heads in tow, the man behind that inbox pulled on an old technician's jumpsuit he had not worn in years and drove himself to Hangar 7, the way he used to when the company was small enough to fit inside a single building. Nobody in the hangar that morning had any idea that the quiet inspection about to unfold would decide the future of the entire operation. He moved through the bay with the unhurried attention of someone who had spent a career learning that catastrophe rarely announced itself loudly. It usually hid in a scratch, a mismatched serial number, or a signature nobody had bothered to question. Mason Carter walked into the hangar using a top-tier access badge but wearing a jumpsuit that had seen better decades, and a few of the younger engineers assumed he was a new contractor filling in for the day shift. He did not correct them. He wanted to see, without the distortion that comes from rank, how people were actually treated when no executive was standing over their shoulder. Ryan Foster, the lead technician, thought he recognized the man's face from an old company photograph mounted near the break room, though he could not be certain, since the founder had all but disappeared from public view for years. Mason moved toward the CMX 900, the jet scheduled to perform a demonstration flight that afternoon in front of a group of prospective investors and the most consequential aircraft on the property that day. He crouched near the fuel pressure valve that had just been installed and noticed a faint wear mark along the threading, the kind that only appears after a part has already spent time inside a running engine. When he checked the serial number stamped into the housing, the edges of the digits looked slightly uneven, as though they had been re-etched with a laser rather than pressed at the factory. He asked Ryan to halt every step of the pre-flight preparation immediately, and something in his tone made the younger man obey without hesitation, even before badges or titles entered the conversation. Ryan admitted, quietly, that the technical team had objected to that batch of parts weeks earlier, but a written directive had come down from Connor's office citing the new chief executive's approval, and objections after that point had simply stopped being welcome. Mason did not turn his anger on Ryan. Instead, he asked whether anyone had kept photographs, emails, or the original inspection notes before the paperwork had been quietly replaced. Ryan said one engineer had taken pictures on his personal phone and had been reassigned to the overnight shift almost immediately after raising the issue with a supervisor. Mason placed a call on a private line and asked Amelia to freeze every maintenance record tied to that supplier before anything else could be deleted, and something in the exchange made clear that she already knew exactly who she was talking to, even as she continued using only his first name to keep the moment ordinary in front of anyone listening. The memory that drove him back to hangars like this one year after year belonged to a friend and fellow engineer who had died in a crash decades earlier, killed by a part that had failed a standard nobody had bothered to enforce. Mason had been the one who signed off on the flight schedule that day, and though the official investigation cleared him of any direct fault, he never fully forgave the industry, or himself, for how easily a corner had been cut without anyone noticing until it was too late. That loss was the reason he had built Carter Meridian in the first place, on a promise that no aircraft under his name would ever leave the ground simply because a deadline mattered more than a life. In the years since his wife had passed away, Mason had withdrawn almost entirely from public appearances, delegating the daily machinery of leadership to the board, while he spent his time exactly where he felt most useful, walking hangar floors in worn coveralls rather than sitting behind a desk collecting quarterly summaries. He rarely spoke about his daughter to anyone at the company, but the handful of people who knew him well understood that she was the quiet reason behind every rule he refused to bend. As he reached to remove the valve for a closer inspection, the low rumble of a motorcade pulled up outside the hangar doors, and Connor, watching from across the bay, recognized the man kneeling by the engine and understood immediately what kind of danger that recognition represented. Before Lucas had even stepped out of the vehicle, Connor was already leaning toward him, voice pitched low and urgent, warning that a stranger near the demonstration aircraft appeared to be tampering with the engine. Lucas walked into the hangar trailed by board members, a pair of nervous investors, and an internal communications team hoping to capture footage of his first major public moment as chief executive. He had planned this walkthrough as a show of command, a chance to prove to the entire staff, in one sweep, exactly who was now steering the company. Connor murmured that the man by the engine had halted the certified installation process on his own authority and had begun removing a part that had already been signed off. Without asking a single question about who the man actually was, Lucas crossed the hangar floor with the investors and cameras trailing behind him, ready to make an example in front of everyone watching. He demanded to know which department the man reported to, his voice already carrying the edge of someone performing for an audience rather than asking for information. Mason did not answer right away. He raised the valve so the light caught the mismatched serial number and asked who exactly had signed off on installing a part with no verifiable origin on an aircraft scheduled to carry passengers within hours. Lucas felt the challenge land in front of the very staff he had been trying to impress, and something in him hardened rather than paused to consider the question. He announced that he was the chief executive of the company, and that every decision inside this facility ran through him and him alone. Mason replied evenly that a title did not turn a counterfeit part into a safe one, no matter how loudly it was spoken. Connor pressed harder, suggesting to Lucas that this was likely a disgruntled former employee trying to sabotage the launch event out of spite, and the suggestion landed exactly the way Connor intended it to. Lucas's temper snapped, and the words left him before he could measure them. "Get out of my hangar," Mason asked, quietly and without flinching whether it truly was his hangar. Lucas insisted he held full authority over every corner of Carter Meridian Aviation and ordered the two nearby security officers to escort the man out immediately. In front of dozens of employees who had stopped whatever they were doing to watch, Mason removed his gloves and set his executive-level access badge on the tool bench beside him, a badge whose color and clearance level Lucas did not recognize, mistaking it for nothing more than a stalling tactic. As the two officers stepped forward to take hold of him, Joseph Walker, the chairman of the board, walked in with the company's general counsel close behind, and the moment he scanned the scene, he understood exactly what had just happened. Joseph crossed the floor and stopped directly in front of Mason, addressing him as Chairman Carter, and confirmed aloud that the board had been standing by for his decision on whether to ground the demonstration flight. The hangar went completely silent, the kind of silence that seems to physically press against the walls. Joseph explained, for the benefit of everyone present, that Mason was not merely the company's founder but also held the controlling block of voting shares, making him the direct superior of the very chief executive who had just ordered him removed. Lucas felt the floor tilt beneath him as he realized the man he had just tried to have thrown out of the building was the one person with the authority to end his career on the spot. Mason did not use the moment to humiliate him further. He simply gave the order to ground the aircraft, seize every related document, and suspend all dealings with the supplier that had provided the counterfeit part. He looked at Lucas and told him, without raising his voice, that whether he kept his position would depend entirely on what he chose to do over the next few hours. Lucas tried to apologize, but Mason cut him off, saying the issue was never the insult. The issue was that Lucas had been prepared to let an aircraft leave the ground while ignoring a direct technical warning. Mason laid out two paths in front of him: leave the company immediately with no further discussion, or stay, cooperate fully with the investigation, and personally answer for every approval carrying his signature. Lucas chose to stay, insisting he had never intended to put anyone in danger, only to move the company faster than its old habits allowed. Amelia arrived minutes later with records showing that 7 other aircraft in the fleet had received parts from the same compromised supplier, 3 of them currently sitting at different airports and 2 scheduled to carry passengers within hours. Mason ordered the entire affected portion of the fleet grounded on the spot, a decision that guaranteed the company would lose contracts and absorb losses running into the millions before the day was finished. Connor argued furiously against the order, insisting there was no proof yet that any of the parts were actually defective, and that grounding healthy aircraft over a suspicion was reckless in its own right. Mason asked him to hand over every piece of correspondence exchanged with the supplier, and Connor claimed the records lived on an external system that would take time to retrieve, a delay that felt, to everyone in the room, entirely deliberate. Amelia quietly informed Mason that a significant volume of internal records had been deleted only minutes after he first walked into the hangar that morning, proof that someone inside leadership was actively working to erase the trail. Lucas began to understand, slowly and with visible discomfort, that Connor had spent weeks feeding him selectively edited numbers designed to make a fraudulent supplier look like a routine cost-saving decision. Still, Mason made clear that Lucas could not simply shift the full weight of blame onto Connor's shoulders, since a leader's obligation was to verify before signing, not after. Mason told Lucas to personally call the affected clients and explain the delay in terms of safety rather than routine scheduling, the first time Lucas had been asked to absorb reputational damage for someone else's benefit instead of his own image. One investor threatened to withdraw from the funding agreement entirely unless the demonstration flight proceeded exactly as scheduled, and Connor, standing just behind Lucas, signaled quietly that another aircraft could still be substituted without anyone noticing the switch. Mason did not push Lucas toward either choice. He simply waited to see whether profit or safety would win out when nobody was forcing the answer. After a long pause that stretched uncomfortably across the room, Lucas announced the demonstration flight was canceled in full. Mason offered no praise, but something in his expression acknowledged that Lucas had, for the first time that day, passed a test he had not even realized he was taking. Word came back within the hour that one of the flagged aircraft had left its gate without clearance and was preparing for takeoff on an internal repositioning flight. The order authorizing the movement carried an electronic signature matching Lucas's credentials, though Lucas swore he had issued no such instruction. Mason concluded quickly that someone had cloned the chief executive's digital signature to generate a false authorization that would appear legitimate on paper. There were no passengers aboard, only 2 pilots and a technician completing what was supposed to be a routine transfer between facilities. Connor, feigning alarm, suggested letting the aircraft complete its short flight and inspecting it only after landing, a suggestion Mason rejected instantly, since a counterfeit valve was far more likely to fail once the engine reached full operating pressure in the air. The operations center tried repeatedly to reach the cockpit, but the assigned communication frequency had somehow been changed without explanation. Mason, Lucas, and Amelia sprinted to the control room, where the display confirmed the aircraft was already taxiing toward the active runway. Mason called for the emergency stop protocol to be triggered immediately, but Connor objected loudly, warning that activating it would force the entire airfield to shut down and expose the company to serious legal liability. For the first time, Lucas turned directly against Connor's advice and ordered the staff to sound the alert regardless of the cost. Mason reached for a backup technical frequency known only to veteran pilots, one that bypassed the compromised channel entirely, and got a response within seconds. The pilot reported unusual pressure fluctuations building on the instrument panel, confirming exactly what Mason had feared since the moment he first saw the reworked serial number. Mason talked them through reducing thrust, shutting down the right engine, and bringing the aircraft to a stop before it passed the point where a safe abort was no longer possible. The jet rolled to a halt near the end of the taxiway, mere yards from the active runway where another flight was already on approach. As the ground crew reached the aircraft, they found fuel beginning to seep from the failing pressure valve, the same defect Mason had flagged hours earlier in a different jet entirely. Had the aircraft actually reached altitude, that leak carried a real chance of triggering an engine fire thousands of feet in the air. Lucas stood there absorbing the fact that his own stolen signature had nearly authorized a catastrophe, and the weight of it silenced whatever defensiveness remained in him. Mason traced the falsified movement order back to a device registered to Connor, who immediately claimed his phone must have been compromised by someone else entirely. When security moved to detain him for questioning, Connor invoked sudden medical concern and slipped out of the control room before anyone could formally stop him. Amelia realized almost immediately that Connor was not fleeing out of panic but buying time to destroy whatever evidence still remained in his reach. Mason ordered every exit from the property sealed without exception. Security footage soon picked him up moving briskly toward the parts warehouse at the rear of the maintenance complex, the one location still holding physical documentation capable of proving the entire fraud beyond dispute. Mason, Lucas, Amelia, and a small security detail moved quickly toward the warehouse, only to have the building's fire suppression system trigger without warning moments before they arrived. Reinforced fire doors slammed shut across the corridor, splitting the group and cutting off the most direct path inside. Connor had clearly planned an escape route through the loading dock well before that morning ever began. Smoke started curling out from beneath the door of the records storage room, and Mason recognized instantly that this was not an accidental fire but a calculated attempt to erase evidence before anyone could reach it. Lucas wanted to push straight through the smoke, but Mason held him back and insisted they follow proper safety protocol even in the middle of a crisis, since 2 casualties would help no one. They used the facility's technical layout to reroute through a maintenance corridor that opened into the records room from a different angle entirely. Ryan appeared with a duplicate hard drive he had secretly copied weeks earlier, after his own suspicions about Connor had grown too strong to ignore. He admitted he had stayed silent out of fear since Connor had threatened to have him fired and quietly blacklisted across the industry if he spoke up. Mason told him that fear was an understandable response, but silence inside aviation always carried a price that eventually came due. Ryan handed over everything he had. The data showed Connor had been buying decommissioned parts out of salvage yards, refurbishing their exteriors to pass a casual glance, and reselling them to Carter Meridian through a chain of intermediary companies designed to obscure the source. Several of the falsified inspection reports even carried a forged version of Amelia's own signature. Financial records revealed Connor had been funneling payments into accounts overseas, moving the profits well beyond easy reach. Lucas realized with a fresh wave of discomfort that Connor had deliberately handed him distorted financial summaries specifically to make the fraudulent supplier appear trustworthy and cost-effective. Even so, Mason reminded him firmly that Connor's manipulation did not erase Lucas's own responsibility, since any leader has an obligation to verify claims before putting a signature on them. When the group finally reached the warehouse, they found Connor loading crates of parts onto a delivery truck, preparing to drive the remaining evidence off the property entirely. Lucas stepped directly into the doorway and blocked the exit, refusing to move aside. Connor mocked him openly, calling him nothing more than an arrogant man who had been easy to manipulate from the very first week. He revealed, almost proudly, that he had always intended to let Lucas's signature absorb the blame if any aircraft had actually gone down. Connor attempted to force the truck past the blockade, but the security perimeter Amelia had activated sealed the steel gate shut before he could clear it. Officers restrained him without further incident, and firefighters extinguished the blaze before the remaining physical records could be lost. Federal aviation investigators and law enforcement were notified within the hour. Just before he was led away in restraints, Connor turned back and said one more member of the board had helped him launder the payments through legitimate-looking channels, a detail that instantly reopened the entire investigation at its highest level. That single sentence turned every remaining board member into a suspect overnight. Joseph Walker requested an emergency session be convened at the facility without delay, wanting the matter resolved before rumors could spread and warn whoever was still hiding. Mason asked that Connor's arrest remain confidential for the moment, reasoning that the remaining accomplice would only make a mistake if they still believed the scheme had gone undetected. A closer look at the financial trail showed the laundered payments had passed through an account tied to senior leadership credentials, and for a tense stretch, the trail appeared to point directly at Joseph himself. Lucas, still raw from the day's events, briefly suspected Joseph precisely because of his long-standing access and his intimate knowledge of Mason's private inspection habits. Joseph responded by voluntarily surrendering every personal device he owned and welcoming a full independent review without objection or hesitation. Amelia soon discovered that Joseph's digital signature credentials had actually been cloned during a board meeting held 6 months earlier. The person who had organized that particular meeting was Adrian Cole, a board member overseeing mergers and acquisitions who had spent months quietly pushing for Carter Meridian to be sold to a rival conglomerate. A safety scandal, conveniently, was exactly the kind of event that would collapse the company's valuation and let a buyer acquire it at a fraction of its worth. Connor had been profiting from the counterfeit parts scheme itself, while Adrian stood to profit separately from the depressed acquisition price that would follow any public disaster. Mason called a staged meeting and announced, falsely, that the warehouse fire had destroyed the evidence completely, watching carefully to see who reacted with relief rather than concern. Adrian visibly relaxed at the news and immediately pushed to have Lucas dismissed on the spot, arguing that the entire crisis should be pinned squarely on the new chief executive's judgment. Lucas understood in that instant that Adrian intended to make him the sole scapegoat for a scheme he had never fully controlled. Mason let Adrian keep talking, allowing him to lay out his full case for the sale and the reasoning behind adjusting the company's share price downward before the deal closed. In the middle of his pitch, Adrian let slip the exact number of aircraft affected by the counterfeit parts, a figure that had never been made public to anyone outside the small circle already involved. Mason asked, calmly, how Adrian had come to know that number so precisely. The room went silent. Adrian tried to laugh the question off, claiming he must have overheard the figure from a stray comment somewhere in the building, but the explanation crumbled the moment he offered it, since no such number had ever left the small circle investigating the fraud. Amelia produced a recorded phone exchange between Adrian and Connor that confirmed exactly what everyone in the room had just started to suspect, a conversation in which Adrian could be heard pressing Connor for updates on the timeline of the scheme, as if tracking the return on an investment. Adrian tried to leave, insisting the recording had been taken out of context and that he intended to consult legal counsel before saying another word, but federal investigators were already waiting outside the conference room doors. Joseph was formally cleared of any wrongdoing, and the stolen credentials used against him were traced conclusively back to the meeting Adrian had organized months earlier. The board voted unanimously to strip Adrian of every position he held and hand the full case file over to investigators, closing out a scheme that had reached far higher into the company than anyone had first imagined. Lucas offered his resignation, acknowledging plainly that his own carelessness had opened the door for the entire scheme to unfold in the first place. Mason neither accepted nor rejected the offer on the spot, telling him only that the crisis was far from finished, since the company still had to face its employees, its clients, and the public waiting outside. Word soon reached Lucas that reporters had already learned about the counterfeit parts and were gathering at the front gates, demanding a statement before the end of the day. The legal team recommended releasing a vague statement attributing the grounded flights to routine technical issues, nothing more. The communications advisor pushed to keep Lucas's original approval of the supplier out of any public record entirely, arguing it would protect the company's valuation in the short term. Mason refused to dictate what Lucas should say, handing him full control of the press conference while reminding him quietly that authority always carried responsibility alongside it. Standing in front of dozens of reporters, Lucas admitted openly that he had signed off on a provisional supplier without demanding the full verification process the situation required. He apologized directly to the employees, the clients, and the pilots who had been placed at risk by that decision. He did not shift the blame entirely onto Connor or Adrian, even though both men bore clear responsibility of their own. He announced that the entire affected portion of the fleet would remain grounded until independent inspectors had cleared every single aircraft involved. The company committed to covering every cost of replacement, compensation, and alternative transportation for its clients without exception. When a reporter asked whether he expected to be removed from his position, Lucas answered that the decision belonged to Mason Carter and the board, and that he would accept whatever consequence followed. Mason watched from the back of the room and recognized, for the first time, that Lucas was behaving like an actual leader rather than someone defending a title. In the days after the press conference, several investors withdrew their commitments, and the company's valuation dipped sharply. Yet many longtime clients expressed renewed loyalty, impressed that Carter Meridian had grounded its own fleet before disaster struck rather than after. Federal regulators publicly praised the company's transparency and cooperation throughout the investigation. Ryan and the other engineers who had raised early concerns were formally protected from any retaliation going forward. Mason established a confidential safety reporting channel that routed directly to the board, bypassing operational management entirely so that no future warning could be buried the way Ryan's had been. Amelia was granted independent authority to ground any flight without requiring the chief executive's approval first. Lucas continued pressing his resignation, but Mason asked him instead what he had actually learned from everything that had happened. Lucas admitted he once believed leadership meant having the loudest voice in any room, but he now understood it meant being the first person to answer for failure when things went wrong. Rather than accept the resignation, Mason placed him under a 6-month probationary period with direct oversight, a decision that surprised nearly everyone who had watched the events unfold. Before the meeting ended, Lucas asked why Mason had not simply had him removed the moment he shouted at him inside the hangar that morning. Mason answered that a single mistake only defines a person permanently when that person refuses to correct it afterward. The 6 months that followed were not easy for Lucas in any sense. He sat through the same safety training sessions required of newly hired engineers, stripped of the shortcuts and privileges that had once come automatically with his title. He traveled personally to every facility in the network to hear complaints and concerns directly from the staff, rather than reading them secondhand in a summary report. Many employees still remembered the shout that had echoed through Hangar 7 and were slow to believe any of it had actually changed him. Lucas never asked for forgiveness outright. He simply kept showing up and letting his decisions speak for themselves. He restored standard maintenance timelines across the fleet, eliminated bonus structures that had rewarded shortened inspections, and established a fund to protect employees who reported safety violations. He made every financial relationship with outside suppliers fully visible to regulators and staff alike, closing the exact kind of gap Connor had once exploited. Amelia personally oversaw the recertification of the entire fleet, aircraft by aircraft, refusing to sign off on anything until every part carried a verified and traceable history. Ryan was promoted to head the newly created Quality Assurance Division, though only after completing additional training focused on the responsibility of speaking up. Connor and Adrian both faced formal charges covering fraud, falsified safety records, and obstruction of a federal investigation. The company lost several short-term contracts during the fallout, but its reputation slowly began rebuilding on a foundation that finally matched its original promise. A federal aviation agency selected Carter Meridian as a pilot site for a new parts traceability system meant to prevent exactly the kind of scheme Connor had run for months undetected. Mason and Lucas developed a cautious, professional relationship built on repeated small tests of trust rather than any single dramatic gesture. They still disagreed on plenty, but Lucas no longer answered disagreement with arrogance the way he once had. During one routine inspection, Lucas personally discovered a minor defect and delayed a flight himself, even as an important client pushed hard for the schedule to hold. Mason stood at a distance and watched without stepping in, letting Lucas own the decision completely on his own. That single choice proved the change in him was not simply a performance meant to preserve his job. When the probationary period finally ended, the board convened to determine Lucas's future with the company. Amelia voted to keep him on, provided the safety division's independence remained permanently protected from executive interference. Joseph agreed without hesitation. Mason cast the final vote, formally confirming that Lucas would remain as chief executive of Carter Meridian Aviation. Afterward, Lucas suggested renaming Hangar 7 in Mason's honor, but Mason turned the offer down, saying the space should instead stand as a reminder of accountability rather than as a monument to any single name. A year later, the CMX 900 completed its first flight following a complete recertification of the fleet, carrying nothing but the quiet satisfaction of a system finally working the way it was meant to. Hangar 7's been renamed the Safety First Hangar, carrying no executive's name at all. A single line was painted along the interior wall: "Everyone has the right to stop an unsafe flight." During the small ceremony marking the occasion, Lucas stood on the hangar floor beside the engineers rather than on any stage built for speeches. Mason arrived in the same worn maintenance jumpsuit he always wore, and a new hire glanced at him and assumed, without a second thought, that he was simply another contractor passing through for the day. Lucas walked over, and this time there was no shouting and no display of rank in his voice at all. He introduced Mason to the new employee with a simple line: "This is the man who taught all of us that nobody owns safety alone." After the ceremony wound down, Mason prepared to leave for dinner with his daughter, one of the rare moments he allowed a glimpse into the life he kept carefully separate from the company. Lucas asked whether the hangar truly belonged to Mason after everything that had happened. Mason answered that on paper it belonged to the company, but in practice it belonged to anyone brave enough to speak up the moment something looked wrong. Lucas looked back toward the spot where he had once humiliated Mason in front of the entire staff, fully aware that Mason could have ended his career with a single sentence that day and chosen not to. He understood now that Mason had instead forced him to face the consequences and rebuild himself from the inside out. Mason walked out of the hangar without another word, unhurried, the way he always moved. Lucas turned back to his crew, pulled on his own safety glasses, and joined them for the final inspection of the day. The hangar doors closed behind them, not to hide anything, but to protect the standard that had finally been restored. A weak leader uses a title to make others afraid. A true leader uses power to protect the people who may never even know his name.